Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 23rd episode of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Matthew with my co-host Matt, or Matt with my co-host Matthew. That's my catchphrase now, apparently. So, for this episode, we are going to have a discussion about a concept that I've kind of talked about the last few episodes, the idea of a stateless democracy. Because for certain conversations, I seem to be a defender of the state, and in certain circumstances, I don't mind being considered a defender of the state. But in my perfect scenario or my ideal world, there would not be a state. So I'll just give an opening burst about kind of what a stateless democracy means to me. Then he'll respond, and we'll go back and forth for 40, 50 minutes or so. So, I'm reminded of, to begin with, I'm reminded of an episode of a show called Hard Talk. We actually recorded an episode about it a while back, but we got lost somehow. It was with a geographer by the name of David Harvey, and he's one of the few well-known Marxists that you can find around. And he said something, or he said a couple things interesting to me. One thing he said was, when the interviewer made the obvious question, it's like, well, can you point to a communist society that's really worked? And he said, well, we need a new kind of communism. But the second thing that kind of is more important to this conversation, he said, because she said, kind of paint your utopia, paint the interviewer said, paint us what kind of society you want. He said, I want a decentralized society. And then he said, I want redistributive programs. But so I guess that would be a good starting point. I do want a decentralized society. I think a central nation state has kind of run its course in terms of its usefulness, if it was ever useful. Okay, so, and on top of that, I also want a society in which there's pretty much universal suffrage, so everybody has the capacity to, get their say in to a particular society in their society, and gets their opinion across, and gets to talk about the laws that they want to have and political policies they want passed, but without a centralized government. And so in some sense, it's almost like everyone's a politician, but everyone's also a citizen. And I guess to add one more thing that I talked about last episode, I also want the society to be, kind of have a lot of freedom in the movement. People have freedom in their decision making, freedom in the activities they choose. So I'm against, for example, the wage system, or the earning money to survive. I think we can, at least in many developed countries, and probably eventually in the whole world, we have enough where we don't really need to work anymore to produce more wealth. So I think I want a society in which people have the ability to pretty much do whatever they want. It kind of goes back to that adage that everyone always quotes when they're talking about communists: to each according to his ability, or from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And then, the things that people really don't like doing, or certain things that just kind of have to be done. So being a janitor, cleaning toilets, garbage pickup or whatever. I would see that as, kind of everyone has their turn at doing those things. And it gets passed around, over a certain amount of time. And so no one person is kind of stuck doing that for 40, 50 years. So I'll let you jump in here. And that's kind of my general view of this, and we'll see where it goes.
Great. I like that introduction a lot. And so I think my I think my mission on this episode, I guess, is a personal mission, is to feel out and I guess to ask questions that maybe flush this out more. And then my more selfish inquiry is to kind of figure out if what you're prescribing is compatible with the ideologies I hold, right? Because that's kind of what I'm curious about. Because when I hear stateless society, it's like, well, the be all end all of my thing is I hate the state. So I really want to flesh out, I guess, how yours corresponds with what I think of that, and maybe how it might work, and maybe if it would be successful. And I might push back in a couple things. I'm not sure if they'll work or will work. Now, I guess I'll start with something that ties into our last episode, right? So as we know, as we both learned, for us only a handful of minutes ago, but for I guess listeners potentially a week ago, is that I'm not fond of the social contract. Now, what I like about what you said about the stateless society is I think it can very well take away the problems that I have with the social contract. Because what it sounds like is you want a system where everybody is kind of is opting into a collectivist, grouping where you're saying, okay, like nobody wants to be a garbage person, but if 1 week of the year everybody's a garbage person, if we could agree on that, we all come together, these things can work out, and nobody has to be stuck with the absolute garbage. I did not intend that pun. The absolute garbage jobs for year round, decade over decade. Instead, we all kind of suck it up for a week here and there, and then we all are more overall on average, enjoying our lives. Now, typically, that sounds to me like, okay, well, you need a rule, right? You have this rule. There are so you have a society of a few hundred people. Everybody's got to be a garbage person for 3 days of the year, and then that's how it plays out, because you need a certain amount per day, blah blah, and so forth, right? So now I'm not trying to conflate rules with the state, though, because I think what makes the state so problematic is kind of our social contract discussion. Like if I didn't want to be a garbage man for 3 days out of the year, I would have to move to Antarctica. But I think when we talk about what you want a society where we can all agree on these rules, right? Or at least, or even if we don't like them all, it's like, okay, but I'm willing to work as a community. So I guess what I'm saying is I think your idea is very plausible, but you have to be open to the idea of people kind of freely moving into your society if they agree, or exiting, right? And I think I think having more explicit consent to the rules, kind of like a homeowners association, right? Because ideally this would be very decentralized. It wouldn't be 350 million people, all these rules abide to everybody in the United States. It would be like some sort of locality. And I think on a very local level, I think that this is very plausible. I don't see why it wouldn't be. So does that bring any initial thoughts for you?
Yeah. So it does raise an important question, because that basically is suggesting, or I guess you could say my arguments is suggesting that, well, a country as big as the United States, for example, where we live, would have to be broken down into, say, smaller and smaller countries, because it. I've said before, I lean towards, I guess, direct democracy, where each individual kind of has the ability to vote on, X, Y, or Z. But as many philosophers, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, said, that seems to be hard to do, except in small localities. You couldn't really do that in a huge country like the United States, which is kind of why you could say we have government at some level. It's like if we have at least according to many philosophers, if a large enough society almost needs a governing body, but you don't need that governing body for smaller and smaller groups of people. So you're technically your family. There's no government with a family. It's just a group of people, agreeing or disagreeing, or some families, they don't hang out much, or some are very close, but it's just a collection of people. Most families are together, but some aren't. And but So I mean, that is a question I guess I'm still grappling with at some level. I mean, how big do I want a society? How big of society can we have, or should we have? And how do we deal? Would small societies work at a in a post globalization era? Because we are our society is more or countries and people are more connected than they ever have been. The internet was kind of a second printing press revolution, and but it's more than just the printing press, because it allows you and I'm in Kentucky, you're in Philadelphia, or you're in Pennsylvania, so we can have these conversations which we couldn't have without the internet. And a friend of mine lives in France. We can talk even though we live so far away. And so can we, in a post-globalization age, can we almost find a way to deal with things at a local level and not worry about global stuff? And I guess I don't really have a good answer to that, but it's something that I'm thinking a lot about. Yeah.
Okay. I like what you said a lot, because it kind of helped me clarify a question that I want to ask. And to some extent, I'm going to deflect on the globalization part. I guess the point that what you're saying kind of it raised to me is, I don't necessarily think scalability is going to be the issue. I think the problem is when it scales up, you run into a separate issue on average. I don't think the problem is necessarily the large size. I think the problem is people being polarized, right? So right now, I think my perception of the United States political scene is you have about half the country is political at all. And then of that half that are political and vote, you have half of those have a vision that they want to enforce top down, and the other half have a vision they also want to enforce top down, but it's different, right? So you have two warring tribes, and both of them want to assert their vision on the other person, and they think the person they elect will then enforce their worldview on top of everybody else, whether they like it or not. So I guess what I'm saying is, your idea, it doesn't, I think the reason why it sounds successful to me is, and they mentioned this in the Monopoly on Violence. I don't know if you remember this part of the thing, but it pretty much drew the red and the blue, and then it's like, instead of having one big circle, what if all the right-wing people isolated on one side, and they had their own, they had their more religious country, and whatever, most people there are religious, and if they don't like it, they can go to they could probably defect to the more secular society, and the secular society has these things they like more on average. And it's like, even if it's still like a state of some sort, and I know for your point, we aren't really talking about a state, but even if there was, it's like, well, at least you could segregate yourself into the people you at least agree with more. So even though it might sound bad, it's like, but we should be able to interact with anybody. It's like, but if you're going to have this government that's top down, people like it more. And I can't think, kind of what you're saying is, you're saying, I want this government, but you don't really need the government if everybody consents to it. If everybody's willing to just say, hey, I'll show up and I'll be a garbage person for 3 days out of the year. And if people, I'm going to make that sacrifice, then you don't need a state to come around and throw people in cages for not abiding by it, because everybody's expressly consenting to it. Your vision is a system that everybody expressly consents to, and that's why I like it so much. So how do you think that plays into, I guess, polarizing views? And I think if somebody came in and was all radical and they're like, I hate this, it's like, okay, well, you actually have the option to leave. So I think it kind of resolves that. So do you have thoughts on that? Because I don't think the size is necessarily the issue.
Yeah. Well. So I guess what I was trying to say, I was kind of making a point that certain philosophers would argue that size is an issue, and you need, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book, The Social Contract, he's arguing that in bigger states you need a republic, basically. So that's really, I guess, I'm not even necessarily saying I agree with that, but that's an objection that would be raised to my stateless democratic society. So, and I guess I would say two things. One, kind of to piggyback onto something I said earlier. I mean, if you think about most of us, the way we live our lives. Let's pretend that coronavirus didn't happen. Let's pretend go back to the way it was pre-coronavirus. So, okay, we go to our jobs. We go grocery shopping, we go do our laundry, we hang out with friends, we watch movies, we read books, whatever. And you don't need. I mean, and of course there are technically state governments, and towns have mayors and whatnot. But at some level, I mean, we all sort of lead our lives, and we don't necessarily even interact with the state that much. And so that's why I think that a stateless democratic society could work, because at a certain level, it already happens. I mean, I don't really. Okay, like basically, when people interact with, like, what's the how do people interact with the government? I guess is what I'm trying to say. Well, I mean, I guess they pay their taxes. Maybe you could say, well, maybe police. I guess they're technically enforcing government policies, government or regulations and whatnot. And that's really about it. I mean, I guess we drive on roads, and I mean, so there's small things that you kind of interact with the government with, but you don't really need, in theory at least, and I would say even in practice, you wouldn't need a government to do those things, which is probably why, you and I are in some ways very similar, although we kind of think about things differently. But to get to your question about warring political factions, I suppose I would say that you really don't need. Well, I guess what I'm saying. I guess what I would say is I'm kind of opposed to political parties. So, in the way I'm thinking about this society, there really wouldn't be political parties. There would just be each individual would be would talk about how they kind of want to see. I'm reminded, of course, I guess going back to ancient Greece, going back to the city-state of Athens. Now, obviously, Athens was not a political or not a perfect example, and they weren't even full-on democracy because they had slaves and women couldn't vote, etc. But they, in some sense, they really didn't have a government, or if they had a government, it was quite limited because people, the citizens, they were involved in the political process quite a lot, and they you could. There were places to have the conversations about, okay, what kind of policy should we have with, what should be our foreign policy? How are we going to deal with Sparta, say, or what kind of taxes are we going to pass? So, in some sense, I think this kind of my idea sidesteps the question of political divisions because it would allow for everybody to have a say in the matter. It would give the people opportunity to have to talk about what matters most to them, and to try to persuade people that what matters most to them about what matters most to them, and to persuade them about passing certain getting certain ideas implemented in this society.
So a couple things on that. The first part is I totally agree with you on the fact that I don't feel like people interact with the state very much. That's pretty much why I'm an ANCAP, because the only time I feel like I'm impacted by the state, it's almost always to my detriment, right? And I think they often in other ways harm people, and then they get away with passing the blame on to other things. But it's really the state's fault. So I agree with you there, and that's why I think anarchy ends up working. Now, I'm going to push back on your sidestep right there. And that's fine. That's a reasonable. I understand the point you're making. You're pretty much saying, well, there's not really going to be political parties, and we're not going to really institutionalize certain things, so that this shouldn't develop. But if you imagine Athens, well, what I think the problem with our country is there are certain. Well, I guess I don't really want to go down the route of heuristics, because heuristics play a big role in our polarization. As people just are like, I'm a Republican, this is a Republican stance, I take the Republican stance because I just know on average I agree with them. But if you take that away, I still feel like a lot of views that people have run together for a good reason. And I think people do have ideological bends. So one thing is, now here's the thing. I think if you got a group of people who are very like-minded, then I don't think it's hard to have a stateless democracy because you've essentially sorted out the people that would be in it, right? You could have a stateless democracy if everybody pretty much falls in the same camp because you guys are all in agreement. So you're not going to get that pissed when all of a sudden you lose a 52-48 vote. But when you have the, I guess, ideological diversity that the United States of America has, if you look at, like, say, a swing state, right? It's hard to imagine that those groups would be, those people in like that kind of area would be able to come together and agree, because often they'd be losing really close votes, and it'd be on something that feels really important to them here and there. Because even if it's stateless, it's like, okay, but like I really don't want to have to do this thing that everybody else thinks should be mandated. And like if we all agreed, you wouldn't need a state, but you're going to end up having these, like, I guess, holdouts, right? You're going to have these people who are like infuriated and they're going to really make their case. And some of them aren't going to be happy losers. They're not going to be like, well, I lost, but that was the democratic process. So a state doesn't need to enforce against me because I'll just follow along anyways. So I guess what I'm saying is I feel like anything that's contentious, if your society decides to have any rules surrounding it, you either have to be very like-minded, which is fine. I don't necessarily think that's going to be a huge problem, but you'd have to either be very like-minded, or they would have to stay out of those completely in terms of, I guess, to democratically legislating. And that's kind of what I think capitalism does a little bit, where I think a lot of businesses do that, where it's like, well, if you don't like the product or if you don't like the message of a company, it's like you can really hate it, and then you don't give them any of your money no matter what. And then it's like maybe their stance is disenfranchised all the consumers in the area and they go out of business. Stuff like that can happen. And I think that that's a more effective way of doing it, I guess. But I'm not trying to really argue what's effective or not. I'm kind of thinking, I don't know if there's a way to really handle that problem without a state, right? So that's kind of an issue I might be headbutting. And so do you have more thoughts on that? Like, I don't expect you to have a great answer because it's a tricky situation and it's very abstract. But I do think saying, well, in a stateless democracy, you kind of have to be homogenous. I don't think that's a bad answer. So I don't know. Do with that what you will.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that would be a fairly good synopsis. I mean, I might add a few caveats here. So to be, well, it kind of goes back to something we talked about last episode. It's like people, and it also kind of goes back to another conversation we've had somewhat about, like, you know, where does morality derive? I mean, and, you know, is there such a thing as human nature and whatnot? And I only bring all this up because I think there are kind of just ways that people interact that just kind of make sense in that context. You know, so and I think we've been using the term kind of street morality. You know, so to be in a group of people kind of means, well, there are certain things that, you know, make sense for you to do and certain things that don't make sense for you to do. So, I mean, you know, I'm not going to walk up to you and punch you in the face, for example. And in some sense, it doesn't even matter. Like, we can have a philosophical conversation. Okay, well, what does it mean when I punch you in the face? But in some sense, that doesn't even matter, because it's just, well, if I punch you in the face, okay, you might punch me in the face. And, you know, that's really not... if we want to have a, you know, kind of decent relations, if you and I kind of want to have a friendship of sorts, it's like, well, that's kind of not how you do it. That's exactly how you make enemies. And that's how human relations start to break down. So I think that I think a lot of people have a lot of similar desires. I think people... they want to be able to spend time doing things they like to do. They want to have social connections. They want to feel they want to feel in tune if they're doing something. That they want to feel like it's worthwhile, and you know, they don't want to be, if you'll forgive the Marxist terminology, they don't want to be alienated from their labor. So what I mean is that they want to do something that they really love doing. So in this society that I'm envisioning, if someone really loves, well, I mean, here's an example. My best friend, he said he's interested in becoming a radio DJ. So in my society, that I'm envisioning, he would be able to become a radio DJ, and he could be the best radio DJ there is, and people would listen to him or not listen to him as they will, but he would have the opportunity to do that, because the material needs of people would be taken care of. And that's true whether you want to be a farmer or a mechanic or a psychiatrist or a novelist, or I don't want. I'm afraid that in the kind of capitalist society we have now, it doesn't allow people to have a certain amount of freedom in their what they want to do with their time, and so that's why I would prefer a stateless democracy. I'm not sure that answered your question. I kind of went on a little bit of a rant, but there you go.
Well, I have a point that's that ends up being related to your rant that's completely separate, and so I'm okay with transitioning over to that topic. And I kind of think I ended up. You kind of agreed with what I was saying, to where if we were going to have like an explicit consent to the system, then you might end up with a somewhat homogenous ideological society. Okay, so something I wanted to get at. I'm going to give like kind of two weird, unrelated examples, and it's all going to tie together. So you just got to bear with me. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Puerto Rican statehood, and the second thing I'm going to talk about is Nigerian prince scams, and then I'm going to tie it all together into a question about stateless societies publicly funding things. And trust me, it'll work out. So my understanding of the Puerto Rico situation right now is a lot of very wealthy people move to Puerto Rico because they don't want to completely flee the United States, but there are certain tax benefits of living in Puerto Rico because they are not a state. So a lot of people want Puerto Rico to become a state because they're like, why isn't Puerto Rico a state? They should be able to vote. They should have representation. And then I was thinking about it one day, and I was like, yeah, that can sound reasonable, but then you have to consider the consequence of if Puerto Rico becomes a state and then is then subjected to all these things. Well, I think a lot of very wealthy people live in Puerto Rico because of the benefits of Puerto Rico not being a state. So if Puerto Rico all of a sudden became a state, a bunch of people might leave, right? All these people have selected to live there for tax benefits. Suddenly Puerto Rico becomes a state. They lose the tax benefits. Rich people bail. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is about kind of selection bias, but it's like intentional selection bias. So you get one of those emails, says, I'm a Nigerian prince. I want you to pay me $1,000. I'm broke right now because I ended up in some bad situation. But since I'm a prince, I will be able to send you $10,000 if you help me. So wire me this money. And within that sentiment, there is 4 dozen typos, and it is almost incomprehensible except to a person who really believes that this is a true Nigerian prince contacting them, and they want to parse this. Despite the typos, they want to help them because they want to get 10 times the return on their money. Part of the reason there's typos isn't just because the scammers are from other countries, but those typos are to some extent in there by design. You don't want a person like me to respond to that and ask for more information. You don't want the scammer does not want a person who could figure out it's a scam to be like, oh my God, are you okay? Because I can see that this is a scam clearly. Now, the people who don't see it's a scam are also going to be related to like the kind of people who, see all these typos. You wouldn't want to send a well-worded email saying you're Nigerian prince and then to almost convince me, because then throughout the process, I'm going to realize it's a scam. But if somebody falls for it, even when there's a dozen typos in the email, then those people will continue to fall for it throughout the process. If people like me answered them once, we'd actually keep them busy, take up some of their time, but not end up paying off. So they would rather just weed us out from the start, right? That's why there's all those typos. Well, that's one of the reasons, that they're not always the smartest. I don't want to give them too much credit. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you have a stateless democracy, you're pretty much saying we're not going to have an enforcement mechanism because that's what the state is. So I guess what I'm saying is, I bring up the Puerto Rico funding issue because if you want to have this world where nobody has to do a job they hate, I don't love my job. It'd be great if I could stay at home and write novels or something. That'd be phenomenal. Now, the problem is you have to get buy-in from people who will probably subsidize the people like me who are not necessarily doing things that I guess are profitable. You'll need some people who will be able to, either suck it up and do the jobs that kind of suck, or even the jobs that are menial. And you also have to get somebody to kind of subsidize for the difference, but they have to do it without an enforcement mechanism. So I think there needs to be some kind of like initiation similar to the Nigerian Prince email, where it's like you get buy-in from people who are already predisposed to your mission. But you also have to be weary of like, well, rich people aren't going to want to live there if they know that they're, going to be used to keep the floor up, to keep the floor high. So how would you conceptualize this issue? Did that tie together in a way that made sense, or do I need to try again?
So what I would say is, I guess, for lack of a better term, the enforcement mechanism is just human relations. So, I mean, and to tie it in to something else I kind of said, it's like in countries like the United States, we're very well off. There's a lot of wealth. I mean, we're the richest country in the world as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I know. So, as I said, I think that would I think that would allow for a great deal more freedom than we already have. It's kind of funny. It's like, if you think about it, think about what happened with these communist revolutions. Where'd they happen? They happened in the Russian Empire. They happened in China. They happened in Cuba. They happened in, for lack of a better term, in these backwards civilizations. I don't want to say barbarous because that sounds a bit demeaning, but they happened in these in these societies that really they were practically feudal in their nature. So, and I think so, and that couldn't. I guess I bring that up because I don't think you can. I acknowledge that in those societies there was a lot of inequality, and there might have been a reason for these revolutions to happen. But I think to transition into this stateless democratic society, post-capitalist society, you really need a strong material background. So I think in a place like the United States, say, or I don't know, Great Britain or France, or these first world countries, is really where the process would begin. Yeah.
Well, okay. I guess part of my point is when I talked about, like, for me in the social contract, I'm pinned in the situation where I have to move to Alaska, right? And to me, a person who is of not amazing financially well off, like that's not going to really be possible. But if you take, like, I don't know, a really random celebrity that has a lot of money, those people could flee to any foreign country. They'll happily take them, and they'll happily host them and their money. So you don't really want to have to shove the IRS or any kind of agency like that in their face to confiscate money from them if they aren't excited to pay it into the system, right? So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, if I was a novelist there, and maybe I'm a great novelist, right? And I bring a ton of utility to the society, but maybe I'm not so great. Maybe nobody really likes to read my books, and your friend who's a DJ, he could be stellar, but maybe he's awful. But in this society, we're still allowed to be awful at our jobs, being creative types, and we still get some sort of basic resources. Well, we're not really generating anything other than stuff that people don't like. So somebody's got to kind of like even us out, right? There has to be some side that compensates it. In a crude way, what I'm trying to say is, you'd need somebody who's overproducing, who has a surplus of resources, to willingly be like, well, these guys are getting a low amount, and we need to bring them up to the baseline. So you need people who know that that's going to be the case and are willing to contribute without, sicking the IRS on them. So yeah, so that's the situation I'm trying to paint for you. You can't really say, well, they want to interact with society because these people have the means to go interact with a different society that doesn't have your rules, right? I think that's the problem I'm trying to address, or at least bring up for you to address, because you have the hard job, and I have the easy job. I just get to point out things that could be potential problems, and you have to reconcile with them, or you have to say, I'll fight that one another day. So was that better clarification of the issue I'm seeing, or at least why it might not be as easy to hand wave as you might think?
Sure. And there are kind of two aspects to that question. So I'll tackle. First, I'll talk about the rich people not wanting to buy into my system. So I think that I'm appealing, I guess, to. I don't want to say I'm appealing to higher good because that sounds kind of cheesy, but let me think if there's another way to phrase that. I think people such as Bill Gates or Elon Musk, I don't buy into this crude idea. Some people who consider themselves on the left, they might think to themselves, well, Elon Musk or Bill Gates are bad people. And I'm not trying to be like flippant about it or saying that all leftists think that, or that's even the predominant idea. But you could make, you could have a kind of an overly negative or overly simplistic view of the ultra wealthy and say, well, you're just evil and therefore I don't like you and we're going to throw you into a cage. And I think it's important not to think that way. Elon Musk and Bill Gates, they're just human beings. And they happened to be human beings who made a ton of money in this capitalist system. So, but I think that there's something that I think in some ways they could be persuaded to be to have a certain different relationship with society than just being an ultra wealthy person. And it's kind of ironic, because Bill Gates and Elon Musk, they've made comments about to where some people like to call them liberal communists. And by that, I mean, they almost seem to be taking a view that, well, capitalism isn't going to last, but they're also, some of the richest capitalists on the planet. So it's like even they seem to think that, well, maybe this capitalist system, or at least the way we have it set up now, isn't going to sustain itself. And so, I think I don't think people have to be rich to be happy, and I think even many rich people would acknowledge that. And then the other point would be, okay, so like, what happens when people try to do something and they're not good at it? So over the summer, I've been teaching myself the guitar, and I wouldn't say I'm very good at it. I mean, I'm just learning, of course, but so I could get better, but I doubt I'm going to be, the next Johnny Cash. But I don't think that it really necessarily invalidates my the society I want, because, well, for one thing, I think if people have the opportunity to explore these different arenas, I think quite often many of them will see, well, maybe I'm, not a very good radio DJ, but I'm a really great teacher, so if we give people the freedom to explore and to, they don't have to be chained to, well, I have to, work at McDonald's for 8 hours a day or I'm going to die. I think people often gravitate towards what they are good at. But also, supposing someone's disabled, so that they can't do certain things. If someone can't say, in this society where like you have to do certain things, okay, this person who's, in a wheelchair, they can't, I don't know, they can't they can't do construction work. That's fine, and then that doesn't mean we're going to throw them in the gulag and say, well, you can't do construction work. You're useless. We would find other things that other jobs for those people to be able to do, a couple days a year or a couple weeks a year or whatever, so that they could still contribute, even though they might not be able to contribute in the way that most able-bodied people could contribute.
So I want to kind of give an example, and I want to see kind of where this takes, because it's relevant. And if you think your response would be beating a dead horse, you don't have to give me a 5-minute response. But so imagine a 15-person commune in the most stereotypical sense. The reason why those don't sound appealing to me isn't because their decisions are made collectively. That's not what bugs me. The fact is, when you have like a 15-person commune in a rural area of, imagine, like Ohio, the problem is all of them are doing jobs that I think would suck. They're all doing things like, they're all like, farming stuff, handling their gardening. They're maybe they're doing things that are like hands-on, and they might not be working 8 hours. They almost certainly aren't. They're maintaining things, and they're kind of living with the environment around them, and it sustains their life. The thing is, I'm not a hands-on person. I've no interest in that stuff. But the reason why you're the picture you're painting for me is at least appealing to me as a person inhabiting it, is because it sounds like I could pursue things that I think I could be skilled at and that I actually find pleasurable. Because right now, I know there are some things I'm good at, right? I'm a very analytical thinker, and unfortunately, I'm not awful with numbers, which means I ended up in a job where I look at numbers a lot all day, and I get a salary. That's fine, right? And it's productive. It helps some people. It plays a role. It plays a function, but it's not particularly satisfying to me. Now, if I was exercising a creative bone in my body while doing something mental, like writing a novel, I'd probably be much more satisfied. Now, unfortunately, even if me writing a novel could even at best provide some people with entertainment, I wouldn't be doing a literal service for people that's providing a necessary function. So on the commune, when they're maintaining, things that are that has to do with, where they sleep at night or their meal, it's all related to a specific part of their day or maintaining their standard of living. But what I would be doing is all related to the leisure side. And a lot of the more fun jobs that people want are related to leisure, because that's where a lot of people kind of get passionate about things. They get passionate about art, and they get excited by books and movies and literature. And I know not everybody would seek out those jobs, but the kind of people this society would attract, that this society that promises a baseline that is fairly high and will cover your basic needs, it would attract a lot of people who are interested in artistic endeavors. Now, I would be concerned that you get to the point where it's like, okay, all these people, it's nice that they can come do art, and they are floated the money to live on it, and they get to experiment with creative works. Now, the issue is, you don't have people who are going out on the farm and doing the jobs of like the people who live on the communes. You don't have people who are like doing these hard works that provide functions that I guess you could describe as more necessary than others. You won't have people who want to like labor on making clothes, right? And unless you're importing all the bad stuff and then hoping that your entertainment base was enough to, I guess, export it for money, it's not inherently, I guess, sustainable. I think that's the good word. And I get worried, as I mentioned with my Puerto Rico example, that a lot of people would buy into the system by saying, well, hey, you know what? I do believe in that message. I think everybody should have a high baseline. I like UBI. But then a lot of people would be like, I'm going to move to Japan, and I'm going to have a great time in Japan being rich, right? So I guess I get concerned that the incentives that are set up by the system, when people get to kind of choose their own path, are end up making a society not sustainable or productive. Because somebody like me, I'm a tall guy. I'm not handicapped. I may have pinched a nerve in my back last week, and it's not comfortable. But assuming normal conditions, if I worked as a laborer on a construction site for the next decade, I'd be in pretty good shape. And I'm a big guy, so if I worked out for 10 years, I could probably lift a lot. I could probably be a great construction worker if you give me 10 years to improve at it. But no way in hell would I enjoy that. That's the last job I want to do. You're not going to get me in that society to be like, okay, I'll be a construction worker for my life. So I'm concerned that that's an issue with it, I guess. Is that a reasonable concern?
No, I'm actually glad you brought that up. That is a reasonable concern. So I want to make one thing clear. I'm not talking about um, a society in which everyone wants to be a novelist and therefore no one's ever doing anything materially productive. And I guess I only say that because not everyone wants to be a novelist. I mean, some people actually want to work on cars. Some people want to study natural science and conduct experiments. Or if they're a theoretical physicist, they want to scribble down equations on a piece of paper all day. Or there are people who actually want to be a construction worker, or they want to be a server, a waiter or waitress. So I think there's enough. Even though there's certain homogeneity among people, there's also enough difference to where I think you would be allowed, or there would be, you would still get productivity, and you would still be able to generate generate the material circumstances necessary to keep that society afloat. Even if not even if some people say I'll drop dead before I become a construction worker. Well, that's fine. You're for your little duty for our society or whatever. You won't be on construction. You'll be, I don't know what, you'll be crunching numbers for people or something. So I mean, I can understand that objection, but I guess I see it in a bit different. I see it a bit differently.
Okay, I think I have. I feel bad asking, but I feel like it's my due diligence as a person investigating the topic. So this may be a very tough question. I guess the simple way of phrasing it is: do people have to work? And to expand on the thought, if people do have to work, then is this wouldn't the same critique to capitalism apply to this society, where the critique of capitalism is like, well, if you don't, if I have to work, if I don't, I starve, I don't have a house, etc. Well, if you're saying, well, you have to do something, then wouldn't the same critique apply? Because I would think that there are I think a lot of people who end up working in manual labor do it because they either don't have specialized skills that go above manual labor, but I don't think it follows that they really like doing manual labor. And I would wager that if you had the option to not work, a lot of people wouldn't want to do jobs that we find necessary to some extent. There wouldn't be people who are like, okay, I'll be the fry cook at McDonald's. So I think a concern is you need to have some people work, or else you're inviting a lot of people who don't want to work at McDonald's in a different society to come in and be like, boy, I hated that job, but that was the only job I was qualified for. Can I just be lazy and keep my standard of living met? So what? Yeah.
That's another very good question. And I probably don't have a very satisfying answer, but I guess I'll say this. I think technically in this thought experiment that I'm kind of running in my head, you could probably you could get off with doing almost nothing, basically. Just like there are people in our society, even in this society, they don't really do anything, either because they don't want to or they're not able to. So if someone, I don't know, if someone has Down syndrome, say, they really can't do that much. But we don't, again, we don't say you have no right to exist, and we take care of them because they just have to be taken care of. They're not able to do it themselves. And I think that I think if we allow people a certain degree of freedom to guide their own paths, or if we allow people to go their own paths, and we don't force people to I guess what I'm trying to say is I do think it's slightly different than the way work. I think we just have to have a different conception of work. In other words, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So if my buddy likes to, gets to be a radio DJ, and I get to, I don't know, I get to write novels, and you get to, work in the musical theater, that would allow us a certain amount of fulfillment that's, to where if you're willing to say, okay, I'm going to put in a few hours of helping people, helping people with, I don't know, their retirement fund or whatever. I mean, that might be a bad example, because I guess in my perfect or in my ideal society, we wouldn't have money in the way we think of it now. But I think people would be a bit more willing to put in a little work, if that doesn't have to be the main thrust of their lives. And I do think it's true. Most people who work in fast food or construction probably don't want to do it, but there probably are some people who would say, yeah, I've worked at McDonald's for 45 years and I'm not going to, go away, because I find fulfillment in that. I would not find fulfillment in that. But that's just because people are different. And I don't want to, I want to make it clear that this society would allow for various preferences to, for people's various preferences to express themselves, without having without having a state, punishing them because they don't align with what most people like or don't like.
Interesting. Okay. I think I'd be more receptive in like 30 years when we're in Elon Musk's post-scarcity world. Because then it's easier for me to imagine. But right now it's not as easy, just because it's like, I don't know. I find it tough to think that's sustainable unless you get the certain amount of buy-in from people that are higher up, I guess, like higher up economically, like in terms of wealth. But I don't know if that'd be possible for certain other logistical reasons. But I guess, like, I'm not really arguing about that stuff on principle. And I don't have a principled problem with this, because it sounds like you have to consent to the society in the first place instead of just being like defaulted into it. Now, that's a lot of my problem with the current society. So I do appreciate, I guess, you reckoning with my questions, because I'm kind of saying, okay, well, even if this existed, is it compatible with what I think? And it's yes, because you're not, defaulted into it. Nobody's assuming that that there's no enforcement mechanism, so you could clearly opt out if you wanted to. So yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at there. Okay, I think you addressed all the tough questions I jotted down before we started, and we're bordering on like 45 or 50 minutes now. Is there anything else you wanted to, I guess, add on, or anything you think we missed that's very pertinent to this idea?
I guess what I would add is, I was talking about, or I'm very interested in, I call myself a radical leftist, and I kind of call myself a radical leftist because I really, I don't have all the theoretical arguments that would make me say, oh, I am definitely, a Maoist, or I'm definitely a philosophical anarchist, so I think what I'm trying to really wrestle with when it comes to politics and political philosophy, I'm trying to see if there is a way to integrate Marxism and left-wing anarchism, which is slightly different from the anarcho-capitalism that you say you believe in. And so I guess I think there probably is. There was the historian Howard Zinn was asked this very question, and he said, that we should take a lot of Marxist analyses of capitalism, but we should also take a bottom-up approach and not a top-down approach. That would be the top-down approach would be the a Marxist-Leninist society. We're gonna create this classless, stateless, moneyless society, but we're going to do it from on high with a vanguard party, and that's gonna lead to our outcome. And I don't think, even if I say, well, the Russian Empire was terrible, and I can see why people revolted against that, I can't bring myself to say that that a bottom down approach to socialism or communism, or however you really want to characterize my position. I don't think a top down approach has worked. I think a top down approach has led to atrocities. And Cuba. Well, I mean, Cuba's a slightly bad example, but I mean China. I mean, I think China, or I think Mao. People in Mao killed more people than, I think, was it Stalin and Hitler combined or something. And we've already talked about how horrible Stalin was. I mean, in Cuba, well, I mean, Cuba's maybe a slightly watered down version of a Marxist-Leninist society, but there have been casualties there as well. So I just want to make it clear that I am not I'm not a communist tanky. I'm not one of those people. I'm not going to defend the Soviet Union. I'm not going to say, well, millions of people are going to die, but it's okay because we're going to have a communist utopia. I truly think that if we take a lot of Marx's analyses, I think we can do it in such a way that still allows for a certain degree of freedom and liberty, and that does not have to be a authoritarian approach to it. And that's difficult. I'm not saying it's not difficult, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I also think that a lot of the I think that our current economic system and our political system has a lot of problems that I don't think the free market itself could solve.
So I do like that as of episode 23, we officially have a condemnation of top-down government, because I know when we did our episode where I kind of forced you into a position to defend democracy, that was kind of what I was saying with the whole example of the ring and throw it in the volcano. And you're kind of saying, well, you're right, a top-down government is kind of tainted, I guess. You're okay with having the ring if like 1 million people are holding it, but not if the 3,000 elites are. And I'll take that as a marginal step in the right direction. if I'm gonna define myself as the one holding the correct point. I kind of like what you're saying here, but I still do feel like that there are a lot of incentive issues in terms of making it work, like in practicality, because I feel like you kind of mentioned this as a bit of a aside when we talked about the Epstein-Wolf argument, but everything Wolf's saying is kind of like unfounded, I guess. He's kind of arguing for something that's vaguely better, but it's not as concrete. But a lot of what I'm arguing for is like very concrete, right? So a lot of this discussion, I feel like you defended it. You did a serviceable job in a lot of the capacities, and I asked you some very challenging questions. But I still feel like there are certain things that aren't fleshed out in a way that I think I could buy into, given that we live in a world that is not post-scarcity. And for that reason, like, I mean, the whole idea of economics is the study of how we deal with scarce resources, right? And I still think, coming away from this, you have to deal with things in other ways. And I think I could address a lot of the questions I asked you from a capitalist perspective in ways that are still satisfying in terms of recognizing the person's humanity, and still, I guess, I think, addressing real incentives more. So that's why I'm not completely on board. But I still think you have a convincing point. And I say it half jokingly, but like in 30 years, it's like everything you might be saying might be like, well, that's way more believable, right? Stuff maybe even way more cheaper. I mean, like, everything seemed cheap 30 years ago. Like if you look back 30 years and then compared to the 1700s, everything is totally affordable. And But compared to 30 years ago, like stuff now for the most part has dropped through the floor. I mean, like the literal cost of things because of inflation looks higher. But like, I mean, when I was telling you about how I reorganized my room because I got a new TV in the living room, like at Walmart, we were able to get like a 58-inch smart TV for under $300. And like, could you imagine somebody getting like a flat screen 58-inch smart TV for $300 in 1980? It's like, no, that one that didn't exist, and like the TVs were just infinitely more expensive. It seems like. So I guess my point is, I think you covered a lot of ground. I think you laid a solid framework for a lot of things to think about. If we listen back to this one, we might even think of some more things that we might want to flesh out or address specifically. And I think you did a good job. And I feel like this was kind of the counter episode to the one where I defended anarcho-capitalism. So
Can I say one more thing and then we can wrap up?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. There's just one quick point I want to make. So I guess one thing that I think we do we do differ on is when we look at history and we're trying to figure out, okay, like what was the fault, or what was the fault of socialism, or what evils were caused by socialism, what evils were caused by capitalism. And that kind of goes back to that Richard Wolff, Gene Epstein debate. And I guess I just want to make one quick point, which is I think if I look at history, a lot of my issues are I almost have less issue with your version of capitalism than I do with the historical version of capitalism, because at least in your view, everyone should be able to consent to living in a free market framework, whereas historically speaking, it has been like the worst of the state versus and combined with the worst of the free market. So it's like we really haven't even had. I'm not saying it's not possible, but at least so far we really haven't had the kind of society that you're looking you would be advocating for. And so I think that in some sense a lot of states are they're in bed with capitalism, pardon the phrase, and I guess that's in some reason why I'm suspicious of both of those, or both the economic system of capitalism and also the state. And I'll just say one more thing, which is I think one thing that Richard Wolff said, he made the statement that both world wars were caused in part by countries attempting to better themselves economically, trying to get resources, and it was also slightly had to do with colonialism. So, and I don't expect you to agree with any of that, but I think that if we're gonna have this kind of conversation of like, well, capitalism versus socialism, I think we have to acknowledge that to some degree, at least, capitalism is responsible for a certain amount of destructive. It's destructive in certain ways, and it can lead to the human cost. And it's really a question of minimizing any human cost at all, because I'm very. I wish we could live in a world where nobody would have to die ever, but obviously we don't live in that world. But I want a society in which people don't get cancer due to externalities that were not their fault and they couldn't do anything about, or I don't want to be in a society where countries go to war because they want oil. So yeah, I guess I'll end with that.
Okay. Yeah, I'll comment on that. I don't. Okay, personally, because of my views, I don't really know if that. I could see how you'd bring that up in the context of this episode. So I guess I won't dwell on that too much. I guess what I'll say is I feel the obligation to defend state capitalism to the same extent that you feel the obligation to defend the Soviet Union, right? Eugene Epstein calls crony capitalism and state capitalism, crapitalism. It's a great contraction. And I think it's very fitting. So it's like, if you want to say like all these wars historically and imperialism are the result of capitalism, well, I'm like, well, it's the state and the state deciding that the state is in essence a business or only cares about its businesses. And then they use their violence, which is endemic to the state, which is the state's unique property, to then maximize their profit. So you can say, well, they had a profit motive, therefore capitalism. If that's how you want to define capitalism, as any profit motive, then sure, I'm not going to defend that. If anything with a profit motive is capitalism, then it's like all abandoned capitalism too. But I don't think the profit motive is the defining characteristic of capitalism, which is why I'm kind of like not concerned with defending state capitalism. I think capitalism is voluntary interactions with people, and you might want to maximize your profit. You might not. You might want to do something you care about. But the point is, it's all voluntary exchanges. So it's and the thing is, people do want to profit, right? I prefer to work at a job that makes more money than a job that doesn't. But that's because I can buy more stuff and I like stuff. It's not because anybody's using violence on me and I'm using violence on them. I think that that's really the state part, because the state is allowed to use violence if the state deems it necessary. That's when it gets sticky. So it's like, yeah, capitalism obviously gets a bad rap because a company with a lot of money co-ops the state so they can make even more money. Yeah, that happens all the time. Now, I think if you take the state out of the equation, then I think that restrains capitalism and makes capitalism the most efficient system to allocate our scarce resources that we live in. That's why I'm so comfortable defending anarcho-capitalist ideology. But yeah, historically, the world history is a history of state capitalism. It's states maximizing profit, stealing resources from each other, pillaging each other for advantages, and then acting in a mercantilist way. It's pretty disgusting. I agree with you.
So would you? I just one quick question. I know this episode's going on and on, but so would you say then that state capitalism is a form of capitalism, or do you just think it's not even capitalism? It's just something else entirely?
So I think this is one of those things where we can get too hung up on words. I've thought about abandoning the word capitalism completely. That's why I almost as a troll, kind of like want to be called just an anarchist, and that's it. Because I think real anarchism is anarcho-capitalism. Because I think anarcho-capitalism is really just being free to make your own interactions with other people. And but the word capitalism is pretty toxic because people think, well, corporations that co-opt our country and our political system, and then they do it for profits. And it's like, well, I don't want to defend that. So either I'm only going to defend my flavor of capitalism, which is anarcho-capitalism, or I have no interest in really defending state capitalism. So I mean, it's all when it comes down to words. Is that all on that front? I kind of am glad I got to address that, because even though I think we've probably covered that before, it is a good reminder that if somebody calls themselves an anarcho-capitalist, there's a big difference between thinking like, they're for companies, co-opting the political process for power and more profits. I think it's much more simple. I think the kind of capitalism I support is much more simple, and it doesn't really matter if it's a corporation or not. Okay, on that note, we appreciate that you guys stuck with us through this episode where we mostly talked about the idea of a stateless democracy and some. I think we had a lot of good back and forth there. I think we kind of broke some ground, and I got to ask a lot of, I guess, hypotheticals or bring up some incentive issues that I thought were at least interesting to me. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. So if you found this interesting and helpful, you can watch the video version on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points. That's where you can see me in an actual high-definition picture for the first time in what seems like ages, because I usually have my laptop camera, but now I have like a real camera there. And if not, you can listen to us just on audio through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any podcatcher, etc. Hopefully we'll be delving more into these topics, and I hope you enjoy our content. So signing off, it's Matt and Matt.